10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 447. Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 447 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. So happy to have you here. We're continuing our series on density. And last week, we kicked off the month by talking about a different angle on density. So last month, we talked about all this different stuff, notes per bar, regardless of subdivision. This month, we are talking about how density relates to different subdivisions and how we can approach basically how we want our solos to sound based off of subdivisions. So last week, we took the subdivision of a quarter note triplet and we experimented with that over an F blues. And we're just going to kind of increase the subdivision, if that makes sense. I'm not sure it does. So we're going to make the notes faster, like more of them can fit in a bar. So we did quarter note triplets. So this week, we're going to take that same F blues and we're going to practice thinking about density and experimenting with density using eighth notes. And eighth notes are really interesting because they're kind of, well, at least for me, it's kind of like my bread and butter subdivision. You know, you see so much eighth note language in jazz, in the music that we listen to, particularly bebop and after bebop. The eighth note is really, really the subdivision that we lean on. Like, we love hearing eighth note lines. They're really, really a pleasure to listen to. So this episode and doing this experiment, it should be really fruitful for you, okay? And we're going to go into it with the same mindset that we went into last week's episode with. So we're going to limit ourselves to only eighth notes, but what we're going to experiment with is how many we play in a bar as opposed to leaving space, right? And experimenting with, oh, geez, well, in this measure, I'm just going to play running eighth notes. So I'm going to play the entire bar is just going to be eighth notes. But in the next bar, what I realize is that if I'm thinking about density in my solo, I need some breathing room. I need some space here because I just filled an entire bar with eighth notes. So, geez, maybe I should think about some rests happening in this bar. It could be longer than a bar. And see, these are the types of things that we're going to discover as we do this work, is you really want to think about the balance between filling up a bar or filling up a certain amount of space and then balancing that with silence, basically. Now, of course, you can come at it from the other angle as well. So I'm going to start my solo with a lot of silence. I'm just going to play a few eighth notes in every bar. And then, oh, geez, eventually this solo feels like it needs more density. In order for me to continue telling the story that I want to tell, yeah, I need to fill up a little bit more of the space. So I think a lot of times people overplay, and I'm super guilty of that as well. So a lot of the advice that we hear, and frankly, a lot of the advice that I give, is to use a little bit more space. So if that resonates with you, if I've just sort of called you out a little bit, I think the biggest thing that you might be working on this week with the eighth note subdivision is leaving a little bit of space. Because particularly with the eighth notes, if you're playing at a certain level, you might just be able to play eighth note lines all day, sun up to sundown. You can run eighth note lines. And what you might realize is, geez, well, I just have a tendency to kind of go into muscle memory. And once I start playing eighth notes, it's really, really tough for me to stop. So, geez, this is making me think, yeah, I need to use a little bit more space. I need to interject my eighth note lines with some silence, okay? So that might be you, and I know it's me. So you might find yourself on that side of the equation. But I don't want to not talk about or discount the people that might have to go in the other direction. So what you may realize is that you can't string together a couple of measures of eighth notes, even if you want to, even if that's what you hear in your solo is, oh, geez, you know what? This could really use a nice long line and a little bit more density. I think that's what's going to build my solo and make it really, really interesting to listen to is I need to start playing these longer lines. So even though, the most of us might be weighted toward we have to play a little bit less, don't discount the fact that you might be a person that when you're practicing this stuff, you're confronted with, oh, geez, I can't string together 2 measures of just like solid eighth notes. So you may have to go in that direction as well. Okay. So remember, you're limited to only eighth notes, but you get to decide the density of how many eighth notes you're using. So let me demonstrate over a blues real quick, and then we'll kind of go from there. I'm just going to freely play a couple choruses where, again, only eighth notes, which will be a challenge in itself for me to play only the subdivision of eighth notes, but I'm going to experiment a little bit with density here. Now, do you notice what I didn't do this week that I did last week? Last week, when we were dealing with quarter note triplet subdivision, I actually asked you to play a bunch of choruses where you are just using that subdivision and you're playing running quarter note triplets. I don't think we should do that with eighth notes, okay? Now, there is one exception to that statement that I just made. If you are somebody that feels like they have an issue with putting together longer eighth note lines, it may be worth it for you to challenge yourself to play a certain number of measures of running eighth notes. But I don't suggest doing what we did last week, which is like, hey, play 3 choruses of just this running subdivision. With eighth notes, and as you'll see next week when we get into like even more dense subdivisions, it just doesn't make much sense. But certainly if you're one of those people that identifies with, yeah, you know what? I realize I can't play, 2 measures of eighth notes. Well, you may want to challenge yourself and say, okay, I'm going to play 2 measures of running eighth notes, and then I'm going to take 2 measures off, and then I'm going to do it again. And then, oh, okay, that's actually going pretty well. Cool, I'm starting to work out some of my language here. Okay, well, let me try 3 measures of eighth notes and then 1 measure off. You can do that kind of work. It's just that I'm not going to ask everybody to do that kind of work because with eighth notes, it becomes something different than it was with the quarter note triplets. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a bunch of trading tracks to the Patreon members so that we can get into this a little bit, experimenting with these eighth notes and the density with which we play them. And we'll kind of go from there. And then next week we'll deal with a different subdivision. If you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say Patreon members, we're a listener supported podcast, which means we don't do any like advertisements on the show. Instead, we just rely on jazz students like you that get some benefit out of this. And we ask you to support the show directly in the form of a small monthly donation. And you do get, in return for that donation, all of the materials that we use in every single episode so that you can just kind of hit the ground running and you've got something there to meet you from these ideas so that you could take them into the practice room directly. We use the Patreon platform. So if you want to go and check out how to become a supporting member, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or you can go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. All the information will be there, what you get, the different donation levels. And as soon as you sign up, you get instant access to every single episode that we've ever done, which is a pretty massive amount at this point. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners or patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. Just want to ask you a quick favor. If you're an iOS user, so if you have an iPhone and you actually have the Patreon app, if you could sign up to support this podcast, not on the app, that would be great, because unfortunately, Apple has decided that they want to take 30% of those donations off the top if you sign up in the app, which is a real bummer because believe me, I'm not getting rich off of this. This is just a way to keep this thing going. So if you could, even if you have the Patreon app, if you could sign up in a web browser, that would be amazing. I would really appreciate that. These donations are not large. And when you remove 30% from them, geez, that really changes the equation of whether I can keep doing this or not. Now, the important thing is you can still use the app once you're signed up. But if you sign up in a web browser, we get the full donation. So we would really, really appreciate that. Quick shout out to some new patrons this week. Thank you to Joe, Happy, Daniel, and Sergio. Welcome to the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast family. And we really, really appreciate your support. And of course, to the over 350 members we have over there, thank you. We definitely could not do this without you. All right, have fun with this stuff, and we'll see you next week with a brand new episode. Bye, everyone.